so tonight we begin looking at, we look at Deuteronomy tonight. We don't just begin, we also end looking at Deuteronomy tonight. And next week we actually bounce just a few thousand years to the New Testament, okay? And so you're going to get this basic storyline tonight of the first 5 books of the Bible. Hopefully something that you, by this point, have begun to internalize, because one of my goals is that you might be able, in any context, if somebody were just to ask you, what's the Bible about? Tell me the basic storyline of the Bible, for you just to be able to start and go to the end, okay? And that doesn't mean that you're going to hit every single detail or even every single book. Each book fits within a storyline, okay? And so tonight we wrap up talking about the law, the books of Moses, also called the Torah, the Pentateuch. I'm trying to think if it's got any other names, but that's basically what we're looking at tonight, okay? And so hopefully you are able to internalize that. So without any further ado, we'll play our video, and then we'll do a recap, and then dive into Deuteronomy.
The book of Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Bible and the final book of the Torah. After the exodus from Egypt, Israel was at Mount Sinai for 1 year, entering into a covenant with their God. And then they had the disastrous road trip through the wilderness, and the Exodus generation disqualified themselves from entering into the land promised to Abraham. And so Deuteronomy begins with Moses standing in front of this new generation, explaining the Torah. And it's from here that the design and purpose of the book unfolds. Deuteronomy is a series of speeches from Moses where he's calling the next generation of Israel to be faithful to the covenant with their God. At the center of the book is a collection of laws, which are the terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Some of the laws are new, but many are repeated from the laws given earlier at Mount Sinai. And that's actually where this book gets its name, from a Greek word deuteronomion, which means a second law. Now, surrounding these laws are 2 outer sections of Moses' speech. Each of these are broken up into 2 parts themselves. Let's just dive in, and we'll see how this whole thing works. So Moses, first of all, summarizes the story so far, and he highlights how rebellious the previous generation was, in contrast with God's constant grace and provision in the wilderness. And God did bring his justice on them, yes, but he did not abandon his covenant promises. After this comes a series of very passionate sermons where Moses calls on this new generation to be more faithful than their parents were to the covenant. He reminds them of the 10 Commandments, and then the centerpiece of this section is a famous line called the Shema. Moses says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." This became a very important daily prayer in Judaism, and it brings all of the themes of the book together. So the word listen, or Shema in Hebrew, it means much more than just to hear. Its meaning includes responding to what you hear, or in English we would say obey. And the word love in Hebrew also means much more than just an emotion or feeling. It's about a decision of wholehearted devotion to God that involves your will and your emotions, your mind and your heart. Now, for Israel, their obedience and devotion to God served a much larger purpose. Obedience to the laws is going to make Israel a unique people among the nations. Just like God said at Mount Sinai, they will become a kingdom of priests. And Moses now says, how? Israel has the chance, by following the laws, to show the whole world the wisdom and the justice of God. The other key idea in the Shema is that Israel was called to obey and be devoted to the Lord alone. Or literally, in Hebrew, it says, the Lord is one. Now, in context, the point is that the Lord is the one God Israel is to worship and obey. Israel's about to go into the land of Canaan, where people worship idol gods that represent all different aspects of creation: the sun, the weather, sex, and war. And in Moses' view, worshiping these gods degrades humans and destroys communities. But worshiping the God of Israel, who's the creator and the redeemer, that will lead to life and blessing. And so we come to the large collection of laws at the center of the book. And they're roughly arranged by topic. So the opening section is about Israel's worship of their God. They were to have one central temple where one God would be worshipped. And also, God was to be worshipped in Israel's care for its poor. So, for example, all Israelites were to set aside 1/10 of their annual income to be given to the temple. But another 10th was to be set aside every 3 years and given to the poor. And these are the kinds of laws that put Israel on the cutting edge of justice in comparison to their ancient neighbors, and it was all bound up with their worship of God. The next section outlines the character qualities of Israel's leaders. So the elders, the priests, the kings, these were all placed under the authority of the covenant laws, which God said that he would enforce by sending prophets to keep the leaders accountable. So in contrast to Israel's neighbors, where kings were thought of as divine and a law unto themselves, Israel's leaders were subordinate to the law and the prophets. Following this is a large section of laws about Israel's civil life, so rules about marriage and family and business, and also about social justice, about their legal system and how it was to protect widows and orphans and immigrants. And then these are concluded by more laws about worship. Now, here's some tips for reading all of these laws. Remember, first of all, these are the terms of the Sinai covenant given specifically to ancient Israel, living in a culture that's very different from yours. And so, two, it's not going to be helpful to compare these laws with modern laws from a very different culture. Rather, these were given to set Israel apart. And so we need to compare these laws with those of Israel's neighbors, like in Assyria or Babylon. And when you do that, all of a sudden laws that seemed harsh or bizarre become much more clear. You see that God is pushing Israel to a higher level of justice than was ever known before. And so finally, try to discern what core principles of wisdom or justice underlie any particular law, and you'll discover some really profound things. So here's an extra credit assignment. Go see how Paul the Apostle does this very thing in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 9, and he quotes a law from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. It's really interesting. So back to Moses. After he goes through all of the laws, he issues a final challenge that Israel should listen to and love their God. He first issues a warning and an ultimatum. If Israel listens to and obeys their God, everything's going to go great, lots of divine blessing. But if they don't listen and rebel, famine, plague, devastation, and ultimately exile from the land. And then Moses forces a decision. He says, "Today I set before you all life or death, blessing or curse, goodness or evil. So choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him." But then Moses says this. He says, "I know that after I die, you're going to rebel and turn away from God and end up in exile." Which is kind of a downer. But then again, he's been with these people for decades, and it becomes clear that his hopes are not very high. But all is not lost, Moses says. One day, when Israel is sitting in exile, at any point, Moses says they can turn back to their God, who will, in his words, circumcise your hearts so that you may love him with all your heart and soul and live. Now, this is a vivid metaphor that's saying something is fundamentally wrong with Israel's heart. It's stubborn and hard. And it's the same thing wrong with the heart of all of humanity. This is going all the way back to the rebellion in the garden. Humans seized autonomy from God. They wanted to define good and evil for themselves, and they ruined God's good world as a result. But one day, Moses says, God is going to do something to transform the hearts of his people so that they can truly listen to and love God from the heart and be led back to true life. And this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the hope for a new heart. So Moses ends his speech with a poem of warning and then of blessing, and then he walks up onto a mountain and he dies. And so the Torah draws to a close. All of the major plot tensions of the biblical story are in place, but left totally unresolved. So when is the descendant of the woman going to come and defeat evil? Or how is God going to rescue the whole world and bless all nations through this family? And how can God's holiness be reconciled with people who are continually rebellious? And how is God going to transform the hearts of his people? You just have to keep reading to find out. But for now, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about.
Okay, so why don't we begin tonight in the beginning? Sounds like a good place to start. So if you had 5-7 minutes or so and somebody said, explain to me what the Torah is all about, explain to me how this storyline begins, then you'd begin, of course, in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created habitations, and then he created inhabitants to fill those habitations. the pinnacle of his creation was humanity, male and female, who he created in his own image to have dominion over his creation, and that he might dwell with his people in the good world that he created. On the seventh day, God rested from his work, setting an example for us to work 6 days and rest on the seventh. We know that God, even though he created everything beautiful and perfect and good, we wanted to define good and evil for ourselves, and we turned away from that good design. We were tempted by the evil one, and we fell into that temptation, redefining what we thought was the essence of goodness, truth, and beauty, turning away from God. And this, of course, brought brokenness into the world. And yet, even in the midst of the brokenness, there's this promise of the wounded victor, of one who would come and crush the serpent's head. But as we begin to see the storyline unfold from Genesis 3, we come to chapter 4 where Cain kills Abel. And so we see wickedness and sin increase, and we see it multiply with Lamech, where he is much worse than Cain. His revenge is much worse. And we see it continuing on to the days of Noah, where every intention of the human heart was evil continually, and God judged the entire world by sending a flood, and in the midst of all that, he saved graciously the family of Noah. And so he saves the family of Noah. Even so, sin continues to abound. By the end of chapter 10 and 11, we've got the Tower of Babel, and we've got just rampant wickedness everywhere. And so in the midst of the darkness, God looks down and he calls a family. He calls Abraham. He chooses him, and he says, through you and through your offspring, I will bless all the families of the world, all the families of the earth. And so he renews that covenant promise with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, and he renews that with them in Genesis 49. You've got the blessing, Jacob's blessing to his son Judah, where he says, the scepter shall not depart from your hand. And God blesses them. God delivers them through his servant Joseph. Even though there was a famine in the land, God delivered them from harm and from destruction and preserved his people. Of course, Jacob's name, if you remember, changed to Israel. And so now we have the 12 sons of Israel, who would later become the 12 tribes of Israel. We come into Exodus, and they are in oppression still in Egypt now. For hundreds of years, maybe it was fine, but after a while, they were oppressed. They grew and they multiplied in number. We know at the beginning of Exodus, and God remembered his people. He remembered the cry. He heard the cry of his people, and so he sent Moses to them, okay? And of course, anytime you tell the story, you've got to miss certain bits and pieces if you do it in a nutshell. But God sent Moses to his people. He sent him to Pharaoh through a series of 10 plagues. God continued to harden the heart of Pharaoh, but ultimately when the night of Passover came, he delivered his people, Israel, and he cast judgment on the Egyptian people, killing the firstborn of those who did not have the blood of the lamb on the door of their house. And so Pharaoh said, go. And so they left Egypt, and they were running away from Egypt. They're on their way to the promised land, but they don't get far before they run up to the Red Sea. And they come to the Red Sea, and they're between a rock and a hard place because they can't go anywhere, and they've got, now the Egyptians are coming after them to destroy them. And God delivers them by parting the Red Sea. They go through the Red Sea. He destroys the Egyptians in the wake of the Red Sea, and they are delivered on the other side. And what do you do when you're delivered? You sing a song. And so you've got the song where they sing a song of victory, a song of Moses where they stood there and they sang a song of victory and celebration to their God. They go from there to Mount Sinai, and they're at the foot of Mount Sinai. God begins to give his law, begins to give his commands. They turn to idolatry right off the bat, making a golden calf. God is still gracious to them. Even though he was going to wipe them off the face of the earth, he's still gracious to them and preserves them. but he gives his law to them and enters into covenant with his people. And so they set out on this journey to the promised land, and it's not long before again they begin to do what? Grumble. They complain, they grumble, they don't like the food in this restaurant, they don't like the hotel sheets, they don't like a number of different things, and they let God know about it. They'd rather go back to Egypt. They want to go back where they had the good food, they had all the things that they're used to, and so they grumbled, and God judged that generation, and he said, you know what, you're going to die. They said, we want to die in the wilderness, and God said, okie dokie. That's my translation of the Hebrew. And he says, okay. And so that first generation dies off. Numbers begins by them preparing for battle to go into the promised land to take on the Canaanites and drive them out of the land. But that generation has to die in the wilderness. And a new generation rises up. And now they are preparing to go into the wilderness. But before they do, we've got one final word from Moses. And that's where we are tonight in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, as you'll see there, just means the second law. It's a repetition, a restatement of the law that God gave to Moses in that first generation. Moses is now reminding his people. He's rehearsing this covenant that they entered into with Yahweh before they enter into the promised land. So this is like if you're married, at some point along the way, you renewing those vows, okay? So they are renewing their vows in a sense. They're hearing them again. Moses is giving the vows back to the people again to remind them of who they are and to remind them of where they're going. Remember, this whole time, as they're complaining, they're grumbling, they're questioning, should we be doing what we're doing? Should we really be doing this? Because remember, they've been slaves and oppressed their entire lives before they entered into the Exodus. That's all they knew. They didn't think of themselves as a nation. They did not think of themselves as the nation of Israel. They thought, this is home. This is where we live. This is who we are. And as any of you know, just as an individual, it is a major thing to have a change of identity, to realize that I'm not that person anymore. I'm who God says I am. Even on an individual level, that's tough. Can you imagine on a national level for us to say, no, we're not this kind of nation anymore. We're this kind of nation. This is our story. This is who we are. Okay, and that's what they're going through. That's why he had to begin at the beginning with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is the land God promised them, and this is our land. This is the one God gave to us, and we are sons and daughters of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so forth. And so that's what Deuteronomy, in part, is about. And as is pointed out there in your notes, begins with Moses' opening speeches, those first 11 chapters or so. I want to give you a couple of different outlines, overviews of the book. One is what you might call a chiastic structure, where you begin with something and there's almost like parallels in the way that it's lined out. And you've got this outer frame in the first 3 chapters where they're looking back, okay? Predominantly, Moses, in the first 3 chapters, he's looking back. He's reminding them of their story and so forth. The next inner frame would be chapters 4 through 11, where he's exhorting them. These are words of exhortation as they enter into the promised land. At the core of the book, which is the namesake of the book, you've got chapters 12 through 26. Chapters 12 through 26. And this is the core of the book where the covenant stipulations are. This is where he's going over the law, he's going over the covenant, he's going over the vows. Then you start bouncing back out. So I want you to think about it. If you've got A here and B here and C here, now you're bouncing back out to B, again, where you've got another inner frame of the covenant ceremony, chapters 27 through 30. Chapters 27 through 30, this is where there's blessings and curses, and as we're going to look at a little bit later, death and life. So there's like this covenant ceremony type thing where these vows are being lined out further and the consequence thereof. And then finally, you bounce back out to A, which is looking forward. So you begin by looking back, and then you end predominantly by looking forward. You've got, as they have even there in your notes, poems of warning and poem of blessing. There, chapters 31 through 34. Okay? Now I want to give it to you in a little bit different way. I've got some notes here. There is such a thing as what's called a suzerainty covenant or treaty. In other words, there's different kinds of covenant, okay? Now, we know this just on a basic level because you enter into a marriage covenant with your spouse, okay? That's a certain kind of covenant, the covenant of marriage. When you join this church, you entered into a church covenant. We have certain obligations to one another. I have an obligation to you, and you have an obligation to me that I would not have to Jim in Walmart as we're just walking by one another, okay? If Jim's not a member of this church, then I don't have the same kind of obligation to him as I would to one of you. So if I see Jim running through and knocking things off shelves and going crazy, I might just walk the other direction. You should know that you are loved so much that if I see you doing that, I will come and restrain you, okay? And I will say, well, what are you doing? And we will have a different kind of interaction there. And so this is what's called a suzerainty covenant, where a conqueror made a treaty with the conquered in which he benefited them with his protection and care as long as they would abide by the treaty stipulations. In other words, in the ancient times, there were certain kinds of covenants where when a conqueror conquered a nation, they would enter into an agreement where he would protect this nation, this group of people, so long as they abided by his laws, okay? And it had several different parts to this covenant. And I'm going to go back, and you might just jot these verses down. In Exodus, you might find various points in this, but I'm going to outline it again later on in Deuteronomy. So it all begins with Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, where you have the preamble, which identifies the giver of the covenant, the Lord your God. Exodus 20, verse 2. Then you move to the prologue, which serves as a reminder of the relationship of the conqueror to the people. So God said in Exodus 20, verse 2, who brought you out of Egypt. Okay, so this is the nature of the relationship that they have with Yahweh. Who are you? Who are you to be giving us stipulations? Well, I'm the one who actually delivered you from slavery, okay? That's the prologue. So preamble, prologue. Number 3, there's 6. Number 3, stipulations. These are various laws, obligations, vows on the part of the people. So Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 through chapter 23 of Exodus, verse 19. And then again, you might look at Exodus 25 through chapter 31. So Exodus, this is a huge chunk of Exodus, these stipulations, these vows between them and Yahweh. Here are the rules that you're to follow. And so, of course, the Ten Commandments would be part of that. When we follow the Ten Commandments, we say we belong to Yahweh. We are His people. We belong to Him in that sense. That's what it meant. Number 4 would be what's called a document clause, which provides for a relearning of the covenant. Nothing in Exodus. These next 3, no scriptures just yet. A document clause provides a periodic reading and relearning of the covenant. Fifth is what you'd call sanctions, which describes the blessings and curses as incentives for obedience. Okay? Sanctions. In other words, if you follow these stipulations, here's going to be the rewards. If you don't follow them, here's going to be the consequence. Now, how many parents put forth sanctions for your kids, right? If you choose this, life. No, if you choose this, here's going to be the result. If you go this direction, here's what's going to happen, okay? I put forth suzerainty treaties every day. I just throw them out like candy to my kids every day, okay? And then finally, number 6 is a list of witnesses to the covenant, a list of witnesses to the covenant. Now, as we come to, okay, well, how's all this line out in Deuteronomy? Gave you some scriptures in Exodus. How's all this line out in Deuteronomy? There's an outline where the first 4 chapters rehearse the preamble and historical prologue, okay? Preamble, historical prologue. Chapters 5 through 26, so these are not in the exact order I just gave you. Chapters 5 through 26 go over the stipulations, the vows, the obligations again. And so there you have, guess what? A rehearsal of the 10 Commandments. Chapters 27 and 31, you have a document clause, which is a reminder of the terms of the covenant. So you've got this refresher course of the terms of the covenant. In really chapters 27 through 34, intermixed throughout there, really chapters 28 through 29, and then chapters 32 and 33, you've got sanctions, okay? And then finally, you've got the witnesses. And so, for example, in chapter 4, verse 26, you've got the witness of heaven and earth. In chapter 31, you've got the Song of Moses, where it repeats this concept of witness. And then finally, you've got the words of the law in chapter 31, verse 26. And the final chapter, verse 34, serves as kind of an epilogue to the whole story, where you've got the death of Moses and you move into the leadership of Joshua. Now, with all that being said, I want to look at some major themes throughout this, and then we're going to end with a special topic of looking at the conquest of Canaan, the conquering of the Canaanites, because a lot of skeptics in the world of apologetics, they're going to bring up the fact that God drove out the Canaanites, and doesn't that look like genocide to you? And so that's what they're going to say. And so we'll deal with that a little bit. But first, let's deal with the major theme of monotheism. Turn over with me to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Now, if you know anything about Deuteronomy 6 is a pretty big deal. In fact, out of all of the books in the Bible, few are as influential on the biblical story as Deuteronomy. In fact, I think I'm correct when I say that Jesus quoted from Deuteronomy more than any other book in the Bible. Okay? So Jesus would quote books of the Bible, and when he did, he many times, most of the time, more than any other book, he would go to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1, let's read. Now this is the commandment, the statute, and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess. So again, you've got language here where he is preparing them to possess the land. It's not like they're just going to come strolling into Canaan and they say, okay, take it. It's all yours. We were leaving anyway, right? No, they're not going to say that. There's going to be bloodshed. There's going to be war. And more than that, there's going to be spiritual warfare, because when they enter into the land, the Canaanites do not worship Yahweh. They worship false gods, Baal, Asherah, and so forth. And so when they enter in, they're going to have to deal with those false gods, and they're going to have to deal with the ethic that is produced by those false gods. You see, whatever God you worship produces a certain ethic within you, which is why you observe Islam and you observe the ethic that comes from, that's generated from that religion. And so you've got the liberal side where they just kind of pick and choose from the Quran, and you've got one kind of ethic that, quite honestly, that they've been influenced by the ethic of love found in Christianity. But then you've got those that take the Quran really seriously, and then you've got things like jihad and stuff like that, and all they're doing is following in the footsteps of Muhammad, okay? This is the bloody God of Islam, okay? But here you've got the God of Yahweh. There's an ethic of love. There's an ethic of grace. There's care for the poor. There's all of these. As he said, they were on the cutting edge of justice in their day. Civil law, all this stuff, they are on the cutting edge. That was not reflected in the nations and the peoples around them that they were going into. And so he is preparing them to possess that land, and know you're going into a land where there's going to be pressure to bend. There's going to be pressure to compromise and conform to these other gods and worship them alongside the true God Yahweh and adopt some of those practices. And so he says, verse 2, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and commandments which I command you all the days of your life, that your days may be long. In other words, the survival of your nation depends upon you following and observing these stipulations. So already you can look and see a hint of the sanction level of the covenant. If you want to live long in the land, the reward of you following the vows and stipulations, obligations, is that you live long in the land. Verse 3. Hear, therefore, Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Verse 4, this is what's traditionally known as the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and your gates. Okay. You know how sometimes somebody will win a contest like American Idol or something like that, and they come from maybe a conservative background, religious background, and they make it big, and then they go off, and what do we always want to say to those people? Don't forget where you came from, right? Why? Because they forget where they came from. Suddenly they begin to adopt practices of people who didn't come from where they came from, who don't have the same virtues, the same values as them. This is the same kind of thing, only it's for a nation, and so it's not just a few decades that you need to remember who you are. This has to be passed on from generation to generation to generation, and the only way that happens is through education. It's got to be something that's saturated in your culture to say, this is who we are, and this is our story. And so that's why he is so adamant that they hear, O Israel, listen. Remember what it says in your notes there. It's got those three words: listen, love, Lord alone. Obey. So there's this concept of conforming to the law, obeying the law, hear and respond. The purpose of tonight, really, and the purpose of Sunday morning in particular, is not for me to stand up here and give you a few words of inspiration, encouragement for you to go out and live however you want to. The point is for us to hover over God's word together, proclaim the truth together, and then go out and live it out. That's what it means to hear. And so churches where they don't obey, what you find is that they really are not hearing or listening and responding to the Word of God. Notice also it's got that word devotion there. Hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God. Okay, and so this is in a sense, emotion, which is where our culture likes to live. Okay, if you go to the movies and you want to see a love story, it's going to live right there in that emotional state, okay? That's where, but love is also choice. It's a decision of your will. Because what? Love is patient. Anybody, patience just comes easy to you? I mean, you're just like, I've just got all the patience in the world when people around me do dumb things, right? Nobody says that. We all struggle with that, and so it is a decision, it is a choice of the will to say, okay, even if this person is difficult right now, I will care for them, I will treat them with respect, I will seek their well-being, and so forth, okay? I will remain kind to them no matter what. Okay, so there's that devotion aspect of emotion and decision, but then also notice Lord alone. This goes to our theme of monotheism. Remember, this is the dominant theme we're talking about right now, monotheism. There is one true God that you are to love, and you don't stack up other gods next to your God and share your love with all of them. Okay, this is not about, I don't think God was really too concerned with them just totally forgetting about Him completely at the start. What He's concerned with is that they would love Him, they're worshiping Him. Oh, here's this other God, let's plug Him into the mix. Ooh, this is fun, let's do this. Because all of these other religions play on our flesh. That's what idols do. That's why you worship idols. They play on your sinful desires of the flesh. Ooh, I like that. That feels good. That's why so often false religions play on money, sex, power. Those are kind of the three main things that idols want to play on. Money, sex, power. Want to get your greed, want to pull you in, want to draw you in with that, with these sexual practices. Come have power, have prestige, have status. And so it plays on those. And God says, yet, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Over in the next chapter, Deuteronomy 7, verse 6, he says, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for His treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It is not because you are more in number than any other people that the Lord set His love on you and chose you, for you are the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that He swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love Him and keep His commandments to 1,000 generations, and repays to their face those who hate Him by destroying them. He will not be slack with one who hates Him. He will repay him to his face. You shall therefore be careful to do the commandment that the statutes and the rules that I command you today. Okay, so God is saying, you love me because I first loved you. It's basically what He's saying here. When you were a nobody, I came after you, I protected you, I delivered you, and loved you. Not because anything was impressive about you, but just simply because I put my love on you. And I chose you out of all the families in the earth to bless the world. This is Jewish monotheism, okay? Where there is one God, there's not a bunch of gods. And let me just say, before we move on to the next thing, this is a challenge to what might be called syncretism, 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 belief that Yahweh can be worshipped in the form of or alongside other gods, such as Baal or the Asherah, okay? So, He's not a God that we put up alongside other gods and worship together. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is land possession. This is another major theme. Won't hit long on this because I want to get to the special topic. But in chapter 1 in particular, there's a lot of talk of land. In fact, if you just go to the ESV online Bible and type in land and search in Deuteronomy, it's like jackpot. It lights up everywhere. Just in chapter 1 verses 5, 7, 8, 21, 22, 25, 27, 35, and 36. Just read chapter 1, just start circling land. Okay, so this is a major contention of this book about the land. You're about to go in and actually take the land. So remember back Genesis 12, the blessing of, well, it was his interaction with Abraham, land, family, blessing. That was part of the nature of God's relationship with Abraham. Land, family, and blessing. Now, let's get into idolatry. Already alluded to it a little bit. He's wanting them to avoid idolatry when they come to the land. And part of the way in which he wants them to do that is to destroy the places of Canaanite worship. They are to destroy it. I'm reminded of something that John Owen said. He said, kill sin or it will be killing you. Okay? Kill sin or it will be killing you. And so they are to go in and destroy the Canaanite places of worship and the Canaanites. Okay, we'll get to that in just a minute. And the Canaanites. Otherwise, the idea is you're going to be destroyed. It will destroy who you are. If, okay, rising pop star, you've come from a good country upbringing, Christian values, so forth. Now you've made it big time. Now you're going into the world of celebrity. Okay, and now you've got all of these influences. If you don't make a choice now of who you are and stand firm on that, you will slowly but surely become something that you're not. Israel, kill the high places, kill the Canaanites, destroy them, those who are unrepentant, and move on. So this is a big theme throughout the life of Israel. Now, a big question that a lot of atheists raise is this concept of divine genocide. So turn over to Deuteronomy 20. Verse 10. Says, when you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably, and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you, and shall serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, and you shall put all its males to the sword, but the women and the little ones, the livestock and everything else in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as plunder for yourselves, and you shall enjoy and the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not cities of the nations here, but in the cities of those peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes. You shall devote them to complete destruction, the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. Now, atheists such as Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and a number of other atheists point to texts like these and say, you see there, Christianity is really not all that good of a religion, because just look at what your God commanded your people to do. And who in this room even would ever say, go and do something like that, right? Okay, and so how is this not divine genocide? Well, one thing I just want to point out from the beginning is that the basic assumption when you make such a pushback is that there is such a thing as objective morality, okay? You are assuming right from the start that there is such a thing as good and evil. And on atheism, there's no reason to think that there would be such a thing as objective good and evil unless there's some standard to measure it by. And if you ask them what that standard is, you'll get a million different answers. Okay, well, they'll say, well, society makes up what the standard is. Okay, so Nazi Germany was fine, right? Well, no, we don't think that that was fine. Okay, so that was objectively wrong. Yeah, but why? Well, because we reason, we understand now that that's just wrong. And so you just get this rabbit trail until you end up nowhere. We believe there's such a thing as objective good and evil because there is one who is the essence of all that's good, true, and beautiful. He has life within himself. He is the creator God, and he holds these virtues within himself. And so his commands are good, and we should follow them. Okay, so even if it were true that all of this is divine genocide and so forth, it does not prove that God does not exist. And if anything, it would maybe prove that we shouldn't take certain passages in the Old Testament seriously, but it would not prove that God does not exist or even the God of Christianity does not exist. Okay, so, but what if we assume for a moment that this is the infallible Word of God and this is true and God really did say this? Couple of things. I believe that this is what we might call capital punishment, not divine genocide. He ordered this based on their wickedness and sinfulness. That's a very important point. He ordered this based on their wickedness and sinfulness. Skip back to Leviticus chapter 18, where he discusses some of the same kinds of things. And we don't have time necessarily to read all of this right now, other than just to point out, he lists some of the sins. I would just encourage you to read this on your own. He lists all of these sins. I was trying to find, I didn't underline what I was looking for. Bottom line of Leviticus 18 is he's calling them to be different than the Canaanites. Okay, he's calling them to be different than the Canaanites. Verse 3, in fact, Leviticus 18, verse 3, you shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. And so then he goes, none of you shall approach anyone of a close relative to uncovered nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. And by the way, uncovering nakedness is a euphemism for something else. Okay? So this is not a pleasant chapter that we're reading right now, bottom line. And it only gets worse from there. You've got adultery, you've got incest, you've got bestiality, you've got child sacrifice, you've got a number of horrendous sins occurring in the land of Canaan. And God's saying, don't do that, wipe them out. This is like going into Nazi Germany and God's saying, let's wipe it out, let's clean house because this is not okay. This is not okay, and you're not going to live like this. This is wickedness. So he's taking seriously the sins of the people. Now, it's very important to note that over in Leviticus 20, such sins result in capital offense for Israel. So Israel, if you do these things, you will die. So it's the same penalty for his own people. If you commit these sins in that theocratic government of that day, the consequence by their law was death. If Israel did that, they suffered the same consequence. It's also important to note that God waited hundreds of years before the sins of the Amorites, before the sins of the Canaanites reached a certain level before sending them in to wipe them out. Genesis 15, verse 16, bears this out. Okay, you're not going to enter for, I think he said, 450 years. We've got to let the sins of this people reach completion before your family goes in to drive them out. Now, just think about it. Our nation's a couple hundred years old, okay? More than that, a little bit, but we've just been here a short time. We're talking about double the age of our own nation, and he's saying, okay, let's let this play out. And some of us wonder, can we play out for 10 more years, right? I mean, you look at some of the things going on in our nation right now, and you're like, can we make it another few decades? Just imagine 250 more years, okay? That's how gracious God is. He's letting this play out until sin just increased. It became rampant, and now it's time to go in and clean house, okay? So, also, you say, well, but surely there were a few in there. There was a remnant. But over and over and over again, what you find in the Bible is God delivering the remnant from the midst of rampant wickedness. I wrote this down. Let me just check and make sure. Joshua chapter 2, verse 8. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you to the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man, because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and earth beneath. Abraham and Sodom, if there's just one. Jeremiah chapter 5, if there's just one innocent person. So God will deliver the innocent from the midst of his destruction of the wicked, okay? But I think that honestly, we have a problem with this because we don't take sin seriously enough. Really don't. I'll talk about grace and love until the cows come home, but that's only understood in the context of understanding what sin is, what it has done to us, how it is destroying us and the world in which we live. And so, Deuteronomy 30, that's the famous line where Moses says, choose life. Life and death are before you. Blessing and curse are before you. Choose life. And you say, well, God's just so mean that we can't do what we want to do, and then he's just going to kill us. No, understand, God is life, and to turn away from him means that you are turning to death. Just, it is what it is, okay? And so if we turn away from God, we turn to death, and so God calls us to choose life. Okay, so we've got a few minutes, just a few minutes. What questions, comments do we have tonight? Okay, so that's an excellent point. Okay, so in our scientific Western modern context, if we say that we wipe someone out, we mean scientifically, logically, that every last person is wiped out. In those days, it was a form of hyperbole. It's, when we say Academy is going to slaughter Rogers or something like that, or vice versa, or whatever, we don't actually mean that they're going to go in there and violently take everybody. We just mean that there's going to be a big victory on our hands. The same kind of thing happened in the ancient world. It's all over the ancient literature where in the context of battle, there was hyperbole that was used, okay? And so this is why it's one of the big things that we've got to treat the Bible as in the inspired Word of God, but we also don't need to treat it as less than literature, okay? It is a kind of literature, a certain genre, and it uses various tools of literature to make a point. And so I believe that there were times where God used hyperbole. He says, go in there and wipe everybody out. But then a few chapters or books later, we see that they're still there. Well, why is that? Well, because obviously he didn't mean it the way that we would take it if we read it literally, okay? And so that's what I think he meant by that is you need to go in there, you need to go into Nazi Germany, and you just need to wipe those folks out, okay? Now, when you go in there, if there's repentant people or if there's people that you know that are of a different nature than what you're going after, then maybe they would be spared, okay? But the point is made that we are going to totally wipe out this people group that we're going in there to annihilate, to where when we're done, there's not going to be a Hitler, there's not going to be Nazis, there's just going to be people who abide by a moral law, okay? And so I believe that he was using hyperbole. Now, you can't say that in every situation, I don't think, but certainly that's the case, I believe, in certain circumstances. Well, of course, we don't necessarily know that they did not have opportunities. My assumption is that God gives sufficient grace to people to choose what's good and right, just as Rahab chose what's good and right. I think God knows what people would do under any set of circumstances. And so I think that the people in Canaan had sufficient opportunity to choose what was good. Now, whether that was a prophet going in, don't have any record of it. But, of course, the Bible doesn't record every single detail that happened in the course of human history. So, could have been some people from Israel that trickled in there over time and spoke of Yahweh, and they just reject it. They refuse it, like Sodom and Gomorrah rejected the God of Lot, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, okay? And so, perhaps kind of like Pharaoh, their hearts just kept getting harder and harder and harder as they rejected the truth of the true God. Some of that's speculation, but what I believe is that God gives people sufficient knowledge to make the decision of what's good and right, then and now. Yes, sir. Yeah, I would probably say just the commandments that God is giving to his people Israel, not only in Deuteronomy, but just before that. Of course, the scribes did not accept the prophets and the later writings. Not the scribes, Sadducees did not accept the prophets and the later writings, and the Pharisees did. So the Sadducees said, we can only accept the first 5 books of the Bible as God's word, okay? And so that's why they didn't believe in things like resurrection and so forth. But the Pharisees did, because they accepted the writings and the teachings. Now, I don't know if the Sadducees based it on a verse like this or not. It would make sense that they would try to do that. But I believe the heart of this is to say these commandments that God has issued through his servant Moses, they're sufficient. Don't come up with different rules, okay? Don't add to them. Receive them as they are. And, of course, you've got other prophetic books that add to the story and add prophetic weight to the storyline of Israel, but they don't come up with new laws and so forth. It's not until you come to Jesus where you hear Moses said, but I say unto you. And that's why everybody's like, whoa, right? Because like at any time on a Sunday morning, you hear me say, Jesus said, but I say unto you, then you say, well, I will see my way out the back door, right? Because folks just don't do that. What boldness and whatever to say something like that. That's what Jesus said. But I believe that's the heart of Deuteronomy 4. Just don't add to the commandments that he gave. Yes, sir.
Seems to me like the Bible is full of disciples of God being long-suffering and patient with everybody. And I always use Pharaoh as a model that when you start to turn your heart away from God, you start hardening your heart, you start going down that road. And I think it seems to me like what I read in the Bible, there's a point of no return that maybe you're never going to get back. And I think that's what these people have. They've gone past that, way past it. There's no return.
Yeah, I think we find ourselves in quicksand, and we can lift our hands up and receive the grace of God, or we can just keep fighting and try to make our way out ourselves, and the more we do that, the deeper and deeper and deeper it is. Now, fortunately, God's got a strong arm, and he can pull us out, but the more we do that, the more we sink in. I do think that's what happened with Pharaoh. He hardened his heart towards God, and it just became harder and harder and harder. And yeah, there's a cycle. There's God blessing his people. There's God's people turning away from God's blessing. There's the consequence of turning away from God's blessing, and then there's the mercy of God where he restores and redeems his people. And that's just a constant cycle throughout the entire Bible, but throughout your life, throughout my life, throughout the course of human history.
I think the Canaanites went past that point of no return.
Yeah. And so you have examples like Rahab or something like that where you've got a remnant and God delivers them, okay? So God was gracious to those who received his grace, but you're right. After 450 years, you've got to imagine it was totally depraved society. So.
Have you ever run across any information about Abraham was shown and given so much land that God gave him that land? I wonder how much Israel occupies today of that part.
I don't know.
One time I heard somebody say that Truman, when he was president, the prime minister of Israel, Begin, they were talking. And Begin told Truman that Israel had never had occupied all the land that Abraham was promised.
One day they will. One day they'll inherit the heavens and the earth because we'll all be God's people and we'll share it together. So, all right, anybody else? Good feedback tonight.
Last week you said you were going to talk about the 144,000. I don't remember why. You said it.
I talked last week about the 144,000, and I said last week that when we got to Revelation, which is the mystery book chosen, that's the first mystery book chosen, then I would line that out a little bit more. Yeah, so you have to wait you have to wait in anticipation of that. Yeah, so right now we've got 2 mystery books. I forget when we're talking about the first one, but the first one, unless we have like 100 more people join us and they all vote for the same book, then it looks like the first book's going to be Revelation that we're going to be giving an overview of. And then I have to look at the second book. It's a runoff. Somebody that doesn't like me put the Song of Solomon, but everybody else was gracious and kind. And but anyway, all right. So let's close in prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for bringing us together tonight. Thank you for just a night where we get to study your word together, understand the story together, and grow deeper. Lord, pray this is edifying for us, not just for the sake of puffing us up with knowledge, but so that we might develop a worldview where we see who you are. We see our role in this story that we find ourselves in. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.